Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. And we're about to kick off here the third and final panel of the Peace Studies Conference today on environmental justice. My name is Ted Gordon. I am an anthropology professor in the sociology department here. I also serve as the Joe Ferry professor in the McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement. And I also serve as director for the Initiative for Native Nation Relations in the McCarthy Center. I'm going to be the moderator today and kind of actually serving dual purposes. We originally had scheduled two panelists. One of our panelists, unfortunately, Angel Stevens, was unable to make the trip today from here from White Earth. She very much wishes that she could be here, and I'm going to do the best I can in speaking and sharing some of the ideas on her behalf and talking about the role of Indigenous communities and their perspectives in environmental justice movements. And so I will be sharing some of that, doing my best, and I'll be doing that after our first speaker, Derek Larson. Professor Derek Larson is a professor of environmental studies and history at St. Vincent St. John's. He teaches courses on American and world history, natural resource management, sustainability, and other topics. His academic background includes undergraduate and graduate degrees in history, religion, and environmental studies. He's been at St. Vincent St. John's since 1998 and has served as the founding chair of the Environmental Studies Department since 2001. After he speaks, I'll then have some remarks as well, talking about the role of Indigenous communities in North America and the environmental justice movement. And then after that, we're going to have plenty of time to take questions as well. So whatever ideas or questions that arise to you as we're talking today, please be prepared to ask them. We'll have a good 15 to 20 minutes afterwards for a great conversation. Thank you, and with that, here is Professor Larson.
So I'm like Ted to a certain extent, in my mind, a fill-in. My colleague Corey Gross is an environmental sociologist who teaches environmental justice courses, and I wish she were here. She is on maternity leave, so it's at home with a delightful new addition to their family. My other colleague, Troy Knight, is a climate scientist. He would be super great at doing this also, but I'm going to step in. So I'm wearing my hat as an environmental historian, which leads me to ask questions about the past. But I also, for about 15 years now, have been teaching an FYS and then now an Integrations 100 course on the future, where we really look at kind of 2050 to 2075. So I'm also putting on that what's coming next hat. And I'm going to try to do both of those for you briefly today with a global perspective. So Ted and I are going to give a really contrasting sense of scale here. I'm looking from 100,000 feet down at the planet to think about big systems level things, and Ted, I'm imagining, is going to talk a lot more about individual, cultural, community-based responses, like what people might be doing. So I'm hoping these complement one another. We'll see. I also really want to acknowledge the organizers and the memory of Father Rene McGraw, who often challenged me personally to really think more about the place of people and justice when talking about climate change in particular, but environmental issues in general. So it's an honor to be here in this event honoring Renee. So I'm going to give you a bunch of images, and I'm going to talk about them really quickly. So take this as impressions. You probably can't even see some of the print on this because these screens are so small. But I want to leave you with a couple of impressions about what's happening, what's causing it, what some of the consequences may be that we might expect mid-century and then toward the end of the century. So really a short term, this is 1 to 2 generations out, we're imagining at this point. But the first thing I wanted to bring up was this recent report, which actually just came out last week in Science Advances, which is an update on a really important 2009 paper on the 9 planetary boundaries that basically identify these 9 areas within which we need to kind of constrain ourselves to not outstrip the capacity of the planet to provide materials and to absorb waste and things like that. In 2009, we had, when that initial paper came out, exceeded 3 of those boundaries. There was a 2015 update in which we had exceeded 5, and the one that came out last week now finds us exceeding 6 of those 9 boundaries. And I brought this out partly to illustrate the fact that climate change, which is what I'm going to focus on, is only one of these limits that we are currently either exceeding or at risk of exceeding. So in this graphic, the basic thing to take away is that the green circle toward the center is sort of the safe operating space, the capacity of the planet to continue hosting us as a species. Everything outside of that seems good, and the farther out we get, the worse it is. Right? So really, the worst of these right now is under this category of biospheric integrity, which is particularly biodiversity loss and other issues related to ecosystem stability. So climate change is actually the worst of these, but it's the one that I want to argue is going to have the biggest justice implications in the near term, and the one that we probably have the best opportunity to actually do something about. So again, a lot of text, quick summary here. If you're interested in what's going on in the world, you can do worse than to just follow the updates from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The 6th assessment, which was released in March, provides an update. This particular piece of the update, impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, is the summary for policymakers on kind of big issues. What's happening? Who's it going to affect? What should we do about it? Separate from the actual scientific output of the IPCC, which is much more technical and in the interest of other people for other reasons. But the takeaways from this that I want to highlight today are actually just these little things that I threw up here in red. First, that human activities are unequivocally causing global warming. This is not a debate any longer. Anthropogenic climate change is reality. We're not going to spend a lot of time arguing with people who claim that it's just a fluke. Second, the widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere are already leading to adverse impacts on people and the environment. It's not something that's now in the distant future. Third, and this is the important, I think, point that I want to make today, vulnerable communities that have historically contributed the least to climate change are the ones that will suffer the most as our climate changes. So that's the justice issue at the core, I believe. Fourth, continued emissions are going to lead us to increasing global warming. We're already estimated to reach 1.5 degrees centigrade in the near term, probably by 2040 or so, and potentially 2 degrees plus by 2050, depending on which scenario we buy into. Right? The optimistic scenarios are looking manageable. The really bad scenarios are kind of cataclysmic, and we're going to probably be somewhere in between, depending on what happens on the policy front. And then finally, there's a rapidly closing window of opportunity to do something. If we actually want to change the outcome of the path that we're on by the end of the century, we have to be taking action in the short term. Of course, people were telling us that 20 years ago, we didn't do anything, right? So the window is closing. So then some impressionistic data. This is global average surface temperature data going back to 1880, which is basically the reliable historical record. There are lots of ways to push this back further, but this is, I think, pretty helpful. Headlines this summer all over the world. I boxed this one here from NASA, hottest summer on record, right? We saw hottest July ever, then hottest August ever, now it's the hottest summer ever. But if we actually look at the data, this midline of 0 is the 20th century mean. The departure over the last 30 years has been red, and more red all the time, right? So it's clearly getting warmer. The departure in the first half of the century was cooler than that mean. So there's a trend, right? You can look at this and say, okay, yeah. So what's going to happen? If we're hitting 2C as a increase from that baseline by mid-century, we can expect changes in precipitation, which means both drought and deluge, right? We just saw the horrific flooding in Derna, Libya, and the destruction wrought by the dams that collapsed there. A deluge, right? Something that used to be a 100 or a 500-year event is now happening 3 or 4 times a decade. And then, of course, extreme droughts as well. Heat waves. We all know about melting ice caps and glaciers, rising sea levels that go with that. Probably less familiar, some of us, with ocean acidification, which has real impacts on particularly coral reef ecology. Ocean current changes are a big concern on some level as the saline levels in the ocean change and those currents can redirect, which could affect coastal weather systems. More energetic weather systems, we've all seen this happening, right? These big, multi-billion-dollar hurricane events in the Americas didn't happen with the frequency that they are now 25, 30 years ago. Declining biodiversity, reducing crop yields, reductions in habitable area, I'll talk about that a little bit going on. Climate-induced migration, so human displacement, and then ultimately conflict, war, and suffering stem from this, right? In an age of less land to live on, fewer resources, things are going to get tough for some people. So who are those people? This is an image made by the Notre Dame Environmental Change Initiative, which is a really great source for looking at things like climate risk. This is looking at over the course of the 21st century, and as you can see, the hotter colors are higher risk. They're on this scale of 1 to 180, and as you can see here in North America, we're clear down on the green end of that. And of course, again, at a glance, the really high risk is in the global south. It's in sub-Saharan Africa, South Central Asia, a little bit in Latin America. There are a lot of people that live in those places. People whose food supplies, whose governments may be at risk through instability, but primarily where climate migration is going to have a major effect going forward. And then some anecdotes, projected impacts on agricultural yield. So this is a 2080 projection from the United Nations Environmental Program, and again, you can see it's the global south, and this red color is major declines in agricultural productivity, particularly hitting across sub-Saharan and southern Africa, but also in this case, southern United States. Right? We may not be able to continue growing lettuce and rice and soy and cotton in Arizona in the future, but that's less of a problem for us than it is for staple crops in Africa in particular. But draw a line, south, red, north, green. That's kind of a consistent theme here. Climate displacement, so human migration caused by climate change. This is data from World Bank projections looking at just mid-century, so 2050, and here they're imagining, estimating something on that order of 170 million migrants, and these are internal migrants, so within national borders for the most part. But you can see here that almost half of that is projected to be in sub-Saharan Africa, a very large chunk of it in South Asia, particularly India and Bangladesh. Right? And the top of the map here isn't even shaded in because there won't be much migration driven in that short term in Europe and the North American continent. And if sea level rise or other factors affect those rich countries, they can engineer their way out of it in the short term. Less likely to happen in the developing world. And then human mortality, this one I thought was particularly interesting. This is a study from just last year that came out in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. But here they're looking at under the high emission scenario, so that taller red bar is the sort of, wow, we really screwed up, didn't do anything scenario, but it's bad. Basically, we're looking at an increase of deaths per 100,000 above the baseline that's going to exceed all deaths from infectious disease. Right? So if we don't really do a great deal of strategizing on climate in the short term, by the end of the century, we'll have as many people dying from climate-related causes, heat, displacement, other things, as we do currently from infectious disease, and almost as much as baseline cancers below breast, liver, and lung. That's pretty shocking, I think, and not something we necessarily think of as a direct result of climate change. All right, so who's causing this, right? Well, if we want to look at the responsible parties as such, if we're attributing greenhouse gas emissions and responsibility, here are the top annual contributors for 2021. Right, so this is aggregate numbers, and China's kind of off the scale there because, in particular, large, heavy reliance on coal and urbanization and industrialization. As their economy grows and their middle class grows, therefore it's getting bigger. So that's one story. Right? China is the biggest emitter right now, followed by the U.S. India is lagging behind us, but is catching up as their economy grows and their standard of living increases, and so does their footprint. That's aggregate. But to look at it in another way, per capita emissions tell a very different story. So the per capita emissions of the United States are almost unparalleled. Our Australian neighbors to the south do a little bit worse than us. But compared to China, where we're 3 times as bad on a per capita basis. And if you look at Uganda down there on the extreme end of this graph, we're 180 times the per capita emissions of the average Ugandan. So that's a tremendous disparity, both in terms of impact, but also in terms of economic development and access to technology, energy, and other resources that establish a standard of living. So one of the things we have to deal with in grappling with how do we reduce these emissions is the reality that some places need to probably emit more. That in developing countries, at least parts of them, and in parts of the global south, Uganda being an example, people probably benefit from having more access to energy, light, transportation, technology. They need to come up. People on the left of this graph need to come down a lot, arguably. Historical emissions, so to take this back in time, right? This is going back to 1850. And one of the things that's immediately evident here, right, is that the right side of the circle is huge. Right? The combined historical emissions of the United States and the European Union as it stands today are more than half of all the historical emissions over the last 170 years. Important because greenhouse gases have different levels of persistence in the atmosphere, but carbon dioxide in particular can stay for decades and even centuries depending on the circumstance. Others, methane is not as persistent, but it has a much higher greenhouse gas potential, so it's worse than CO2, doesn't stick around as long. But if we kind of lump all this together and look at how did we get here, we got here primarily by North America and Western Europe burning coal, burning fossil fuels, and industrializing all the way back into the 19th century. Great advantages to our economies, standard of living and development. Much of the rest of the world hasn't had that opportunity. So we get these debates over equity of access, right? What's the fair share of this global carbon budget going forward, given that it was so unequally distributed in the past? And then finally, this is looking at deciles of individual emitters. So this is again from a report that came out, in this case 2 years ago, from the IEA, that I think is fascinating because it shows at a glance here that the top 10% of emitters globally, right, this isn't countries, this is individuals, are responsible for almost half of all emissions. So the jet-setting people flipping around in their private Lear jets and building McMansions and really top of the pole there, half of all emissions. And if we lump together the top 3 deciles, so the 30% of the highest emitters, that's 80% of all emissions on an annualized basis. And if you look at the bottom 3 deciles, I didn't actually add this up, but it's 3.7%. So there's clearly a gross disparity between the high-emitting individuals and the low-emitting individuals. Bringing that closer to parity would have radical effects on both groups. And we need to think about what that might look like and how to get there. This is another recent study that I was really interested in. The World Inequality Lab released this last fall, or I guess this spring. It's from a document called the Climate Inequality Report. It's a busy graph, but it basically makes a very simple point. 30 years ago, 2/3 of global carbon inequality was country-to-country inequality. Rich countries, poor countries, global north, global south. Today, or in 2019, 2/3 of that inequality was between individuals within countries. So it's no longer as simple just to say, well, the north and the south are the cause and effect, or the perpetrator and the victim, if you want to put it in those frames. But it's rich and poor. And rich and poor often within countries. So in many cases, some of the highest emitters are in some of the poorest countries as individuals. So that means we have to think of different approaches. We can't simply do this at a geographic scale, or national scale, or regional scale, but we really have to think about perhaps individual behaviors. Looking forward out to the end of the century, so this is taken from now a 6-year-old report, but this is IPCC data projected. If we do nothing by the end of the century, we're looking at 4 to almost 5 degrees C change on a global average basis. If we sort of stick with the current policies we have, with 2.5 to maybe 3, if we actually held to the pledges that we had made, Kyoto, Paris, and so forth, we have a shot at a little over 2. And then the fantasy world is sort of like keeping it below 2 degrees or down even to 1.5. So those are probably off the table. Realistically speaking, the question is, which of those paths are we actually going to be on? The high emission scenario, which is sort of business as usual, middle ones, which are sort of modest restrictions and changes, maybe some significant technological improvements in things like carbon sequestration and capture, or the optimistic one. Hey, what if we all really got our act together and decided to do something about this? We might get it down to 2. So what does that mean? Well, here are some projections. This is data drawn from the Stern report, which is now old, but is still pretty commonly referred to when people are talking about potential changes. So we are already at that arrow I inserted on the bottom left, a little over 1 degree over historical levels in 2020. The IPCC says we're probably going to pick up another degree by 2050. Optimistically, could be worse. At the end of the century, we could, under the very bad scenarios, be up to around 4. So the thing to look here is, well, what's showing up, right? We're already seeing, right, glaciers disappearing. My family goes to Glacier National Park. We have family in Alaska. And just in the last 25 years, we've seen glaciers receding in both locations. And they're going to be gone. Glacier National Park won't have any glaciers by mid-century. It's the park formerly known as Glacier at that point. Does that affect us all? Debatable, but it's important. Coral reef damage, we're seeing this, the Great Barrier Reef in particular, but in the coral reef ecology all over the place is impacted by this. There's some positives, right? So increasing agricultural yields in some northern latitudes. We may be growing a lot of corn in Manitoba 30 years from now. Not today. But as we move to the right on this chart, stuff gets worse. And of course, it's shaded red to indicate that. So more storms, forest fires, droughts, floods. That sounds familiar already, I think, to many of us. Decreases in freshwater availability, falling crop yields, right? Plus, of course, rising sea level, which is going to threaten coastal littoral areas. So break it all down. This is ultimately, I love this map because it just sort of lays this out. The top is greenhouse gas emissions, so who's contributing? High emission states in red, low emissions in blue. And the bottom are risks, high vulnerability in red, low vulnerability in blue. And it's pretty obvious, right? The developed northern, western economies are responsible for the bulk of the emissions. China's catching up. The most vulnerable are the people who aren't responsible for those emissions, largely in the global south, but not exclusively. Also, of course, Pacific Islanders and people in places that are going to be particularly vulnerable to shorter term changes in either sea level or climate. So that leaves me then with just 4 quick concluding statements. One, climate justice, I'd argue, is really an issue of disparity, and it's rich in form. Within countries and between countries. So we can no longer really, I think, fairly say that it's just North versus South or the US versus developing countries. It's gotten more complex. Second, any solutions that are going to work have to be multilateral and collective. We're not going to do anything meaningful on a national basis. Meeting, yes, but not in terms of long-term solutions. And they're going to, anything effective is going to require major changes in consumption patterns of the wealthy, which is all of us, right, in this global context. Third, I would argue all environmental justice issues either stem from directly climate change or they're going to be exacerbated by climate change. So if we're talking about justice in an environmental context, we can't separate it from climate change that easily. And finally, I guess I'll leave with the hopeful note that the possibility of limiting human suffering from climate change is going to be really dependent on what we do now in the next 25 years. Right? That window is closing. Again, 20 years ago, I go to conferences and people, with Nobel Prizes would say, we've got 5 years, we've got 5 years. Well, it's long past 5 years. The world hasn't ended, but it's getting worse. So I'd argue we've got a window, and mid-century is probably the point at which we'll determine what the world our grandchildren, my grandchildren potentially, will inherit is going to look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Larson. And as I said at the introduction of this panel, my name is Ted Gordon, and I'm kind of serving a dual role here, both as moderator, but also I'm standing in for who's going to be our second speaker, Angel Stevens. Angel is a member of the White Earth Nation and an active activist and an advocate for environmental justice causes who's really been involved at a very grassroots level. She wishes that she was able to be here today. I'm not going to be able to do full justice to what she was going to be to what she was going to speak to, but in my role as a scholar of Native American Studies and as director of our new Initiative for Native Nation Relations, I've had the privilege of working with indigenous communities on a whole host of issues, including environmental issues. And this is something that myself I'm both involved in both teaching in the classroom, but also in finding ways to connect students with real opportunities to work with indigenous grassroots organizations working towards climate justice and environmental justice. And so that's my kind of my own introduction to my own talk here, which I'm going to build on a couple of different ideas here. First, off of Professor Larson, as you were just sharing, I used to really think about this way too, and I'm now realizing how problematic it was of the issue of climate change and of it really being a north-south issue. When it is to some extent, but it's also, you look in within any country, and you can see that it's really those at the top that are producing the overwhelming majority of greenhouse gases. And throughout the world, it's really those that are the least at fault for climate change that bear the greatest brunt for it. And so that's a really, I think you set the stage really well, better than, it's a great way to start thinking here for indigenous communities who are the original stewards of this land, but also they bear the greatest brunt of the impacts of climate change while also being at the front lines for it. And in terms of their work on the front lines here, I want to build on, just touch a little bit on the panel that went before us, Abid and Professor John Abajani. It was really incredible to hear from both of you different religious perspectives, Catholic, Benedictine, and Islamic, about the ways in which spirituality can be a motivating force for communities to organize around climate change. I'm going to start with that for talking about indigenous communities because, there are a lot of things that can get people motivated to improve the world around them. One of the best factors out there, one of the best ways to do that, organizing forces, is spirituality, but that can look very different for different communities, and that can make it hard sometimes for communities that have similar goals to actually be able to get together. And when we're talking about indigenous environmental activists, for those that are coming from indigenous spirituality, that spirituality might look very different from the non-indigenous collaborators that they might be working with. So I'm going to share I'm going to share two very brief examples of origin stories, and with first the caveat that North America is home to hundreds of diverse indigenous communities, each with their own spirituality, their own spiritual practices, their own political organizations, their own languages. And so I'm just sharing two just to illustrate some of the diversity so you can see some of the big differences here. This is not to say that this is kind of an umbrella for all indigenous perspectives, although from these two, which come from two very different places, I'll share an example from the Cahuilla in the interior part of Southern California, I think around Palm Springs, and I'll share an example from the Potawatomi, I think Wisconsin, just next door. I'll have these two different examples as a way of being able to show these are two different origin stories with environmental messages in there, embedded in them. And then we can kind of take a step back and say, well, these are different stories from different parts of North America, but here are some of the overarching themes here. So first for the Cahuilla, again, think Palm Springs, Coachella Valley, for their homelands. Their origin story, and I'm not going to go into great depth here, but just to, a very surface level introduction is, they had not one creator, but two creators, twin brothers, who created the earth really just out of curiosity for something to do while they were in the void and looking for something to make. And as they were experimenting by pulling mud and water and different kinds of things from within themselves and building this kind of a ball of mud that became the earth, but it kept falling apart. And there was nothing that was binding it together, so they kept finding new things. They were added more water, they added trees, they added prairies, they added animals and insects and everything. And then it held together. But it took multiple times of adding new things. And then after that, they made people. And so that's what we see happening there in their creation story. Later on, what happens in that creation story is the two brothers have a fight, the one goes away, and then the one remaining creator ends up having a dispute with the people who created, who do away with him, and they end up killing their own creator. And so their own devotion to keeping the earth stable is really, one where they know that protecting protecting plants and animals and water, protecting the natural world is the only way to keep things held together. Now, the other creation story I want to share, much closer here, is one that I first learned from Robin Wall Kimmerer in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She gave a fantastic talk here last year. So she has in the first chapter of her book, Sky Woman Falling, she tells the Potawatomi creation story, where there is a woman who falls out of the sky. There's another world, a sky world. She ends up falling through a hole in that and falls into a world where there's nothing but water. And she's in great danger because she's just going to land and hit water. And what ends up happening is geese see her, and they come together and they form a bed for her to land on, breaking her fall and saving her life. But then she's just there on geese. So other animals come up and swim around. And a turtle comes up and says, you can be on my back. But the turtle's back itself isn't very big. And there's other animals that come. There's a loon that says, how about I go to the depth of the water and pull some up, and pull some mud up that we can spread across the turtle's back. The loon can't go far enough. There's a beaver that tries, can't quite do it. It's ultimately the muskrat that does it. And when that muskrat comes back up with water, it gets spread out across the turtle's back, and that expands to become Turtle Island, and that's where we are today. And that sky woman falling, when she was falling, she was pregnant. And so she had the seed of the future of humanity within her. She also had the seeds of plants in her as well, in her dress. And so when Turtle Island begins to expand, those plants, those seeds begin to germinate and become the plant world around us. Again, in this story here, it's really plants and animals that come together to save humanity. And what we see in both of these cases, in both of these stories, they're incredibly different, what I just shared with you, and from very different parts of North America. But if one were to take a step back here, first, there are very clear messages about protecting the environment in both. But those messages in both are really one about certainly keeping the world together. We see that in the case for the Kuya. We also see as well, for the Potawatomi, animals really sacrificing themselves for people. We have those stories. The Kuya have those stories as well, and you see similar stories to that for indigenous communities across North America, where humans come last, and that doesn't grant us dominion over animals. Rather, that means that animals look at us with pity and see ways in which we're not really well adapted for our environment and come up with ways of helping us. And so there's a very different relationship here. And one of the key parts of this here for indigenous, if one were to try to make a generalization, and even this might be a bit too far, but because of the diversity of indigenous communities, but one rather safe generalization is that the view of the relationship between humans and animals and the natural world is that between relatives, that between family members. And that's the level of obligation that's there. That makes me think, though, taking a couple steps back further, it makes me think of John, about the comments you had in your talk earlier about, we should think about ourselves as not just being like good consumers. From these indigenous perspectives, the answer to that was, if you're not just going to be a good consumer, well, be a good relative and see the family connections that are there throughout everything around you. We could go into this and further. I want to get to some concrete examples of environmental justice in just a moment, but when we explore this further, we can see for the Dakota and Anishinaabe, whose homelands we're on, water is seen literally as being blood of the earth. And for the Dakota, their word, bedote, is the same word. It's the word that's used where you have two bodies of water come together. It's the same word they use for where two arteries come together in the human body. Water is blood in their perspective here. That's how serious they take this. Now, skipping ahead a little bit here, when we're looking at the colonization that took place in North America, where the ultimate goal of colonizing governments, including the United States, was one of removing indigenous people from their homeland, so that settlers could have full control over all indigenous land and resources. One of the things that we see taking place here is we have this whole period of treaty making that takes place up until the 1870s. And in every one of those treaties, you can see indigenous communities, for whichever one is signing them, making a priority the protection of environmental resources. They're in every treaty to whatever extent the tribes were able to get the government agents to inscribe those in treaties. You see them there. When you look at the treaties in Minnesota, you can see in particular, every treaty is slightly different, but one overarching theme in all of these is that there should be, tribes should continue to have the right to hunt, fish, and gather on the lands that are ceded. So even land that's been ceded, for indigenous communities, you have land that is reserved for them in treaties, that becomes known as a reservation, but all that other land that's ceded, indigenous communities in those treaties, they have the right to hunt, gather, and fish on those lands. And to take this another step further as well, while almost virtually every single treaty has been broken or disregarded in one form or another, they still have legal standing. You can see the importance for that legal standing right in the United States Constitution. The Supremacy Clause in Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution, if you look it up and you'll see in there, it says that treaties are the supreme law of the land. And so those treaty rights are also constitutionally backed rights. Now, moving from here's the indigenous perspective on relationships with the environment to here's what indigenous communities did under threat of colonization at those moments of being removed from their land, what they did to try to protect the environment and protect their access to it, to, all right, what's going on today? And we're covering a lot of ground in one talk here, right, there's no shortage of challenges and threats, both local and global. Professor Larson, as you just shared, right, I mean, the climate change, that impacts everybody no matter where they are in the world. The specific impacts might look a little bit different depending on where you are, but it touches everyone. For indigenous communities, you have all those global issues. You also have a whole range of ways in which their spirituality, their culture, their economy, their ability to feed themselves are really tied up in preserving the environment. I'm going to give kind of just one real quick example of that, and that is of wild rice, a food which for the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe people is central to their prophecies. That's why they migrated from the East Coast to Minnesota, to the land where food grows on water. And it's the first food that's fed to, it's the first solid food that's fed to a baby when as they're being weaned. It's also traditionally the last food that somebody would eat before death. Incredibly important spiritually, incredibly important economically. This is, we're in wild rice season right now. And so the ability to be able to go out and gather wild rice on lakes, within just a 2 or 3 week period, the lakes in this area here, those that have wild rice in them that's healthy and where it's still growing, they're able to gather enough in there that can be preserved and in many cases, traditionally, be able to be stored throughout the year. And it's incredibly nutritious. And so this is, for communities here that have limited access to economic development, limited access to jobs and income, this is a healthy and nutritious and spiritually significant way that they can feed themselves just by gathering it a couple of weeks every year. Here are some of the major threats though. At a global level, climate change raises the temperature of lakes. But also when you see different kinds of development projects coming through, where you probably see most of this in the news lately has been relationship to pipelines bringing tar sands oil from Canada through the United States, with many of those pipelines going through areas where wild rice grows. Both disturbing those areas as the pipeline is being put in, but those pipelines, they need to be replaced every couple of decades because they leak. And when that leaks out into lakes, that hinders people's ability, that hinders the quality of the water, that ends up putting toxins, other environmental contaminants into the wild rice and fish as well, that make it harder for indigenous people to feed themselves. And so that's a motivating factor here that we have to keep in mind. And that's where there's been a whole range of really exciting grassroots movements. There was during our keynote talk, Ken Coffey, you were talking about some of the fantastic work of grassroots movements across the world, and as you talked about examples in Brazil, where the Constitution mandates that there has to be consultation. Well, it's not in our Constitution, but we have laws in the United States that mandate consultation as well. But as you were sharing those examples where, all right, there's supposed to be consultation, but sometimes it's not done at all, or it happens at the last minute, or indigenous communities' perspectives aren't taken seriously at all. What we see in the United States is the same kind of thing, where we have those laws in place, but they are, if they're followed at all, they are often disregarded. And so, you had an example there. It said, of indigenous communities come up with guidelines and saying, when you consult, you have to consult with our indigenous government, not just whatever person you find that is amenable to being paid to say what you want. We see the same kinds of things right here in Minnesota and in resisting pipelines as well, with tribal governments and grassroots organizations resisting pipelines, but some of these companies like Enbridge, finding one or two people who, if they're paid the right amount, are willing to say, "Oh, I'm the consultant," when they don't represent anyone other than themselves. What we've seen though coalescing in the last decade or so around pipelines, the Dakota Access Pipeline that you may be familiar with. In North Dakota, with line 3, which was completed about 2 years ago, and then with line 5 as well, which is where there's an ongoing fight in Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. What we could see here is grassroots indigenous and non-indigenous activists getting together and working to go and challenge, in some cases, use direct action to try to slow down pipelines, but also a really effective method here is just getting the word out to the public. And I've heard throughout this conference today, where's their look for hope in this when there is a lot of doom and gloom out there, and it's easy to get sucked into that. But we really are at a pivotal moment, not just in terms of when to address climate change, but where we're actually seeing organizations, grassroots movements coming together, seeing their diversity, their spiritual diversity as strengths, and coming together and forming coalitions that are getting the word out and motivating other people. And I can say, I've heard others share earlier today, and I can say this as well, that I've seen just in my short time as a teacher and instructor, I've seen the difference in attitudes among students here, and I've seen the difference in attitudes in the public, where people are now aware of these issues. That's why I really think we have reason to be optimistic. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you all. And again, I left us time for questions, and we have John Armajani has the mic, and Derek and I can take whatever questions you may have.
Thank you. We're just going to have to go without microphones because it does
switches at the very top.
Does that one? Hello? Does that one work, Frank?
It was working earlier.
See, it's turned on and it's not working.
We'll just talk really loud.
I don't know if that one's working. We can hear you.
So I'll moderate. Please feel free to raise your hand and ask a question, make a comment, react or respond in some way. Go ahead. Anybody. Which questions do you have for our panelists, or what would you like to say? Dr. Conklin, by all means, go right ahead.
Two great presentations, thank you. Learned a lot, and I did like the pairing of two very different ways of knowing about the problem, and that's really the crux of my question. So you mentioned IPCC, Derek, and it's a great resource. I've been a reviewer for the IPCC. You can't offer a comment to them unless you provide the citation of where what is the basis in the peer-reviewed scientific literature for the claim that you're making? And that's a very narrow kind of paradigm, right? So I'm wondering, I'd love to hear each of you just reflect a little bit on how do we integrate these different ways of knowing? How do we build out our approach to these issues in ways that take the science very, very seriously while allowing the space for these more sort of culturally rooted and interpretive understandings or lived experiential knowledge, right? Because they know what the pipeline is doing to the wild rice, but somehow it's hard to prove that in environmental impact assessment. So how do we, or just do you have any thoughts about, have you seen interesting examples of those things coming together? Or what are some of the challenges? Or just because I'm so struck by the two different kind of epistemologies underlying the presentations, and it's really powerful if we can tap that somehow.
Yeah, so I would say the solution is to create space for dialogue and to get people to engage across those boundaries. So the scientists that are working for the IPCC should not just be talking to one another or their reviewers. They should be in dialogue with people on the ground around the world who are coming from a variety of perspectives, indigenous and faith-based and political and others, and vice versa. You can't just speak to these issues from a purely cultural perspective without engaging the science on some level, particularly when we're talking about moving global institutions like the UNEP or the World Bank or the IMF. They're not going to be particularly amenable to just like, well, my culture says you can't do this. They'll just ignore you. So we need to figure out ways to create a dialogue. And I think, Ted kind of pointed out, and unfortunately, I wasn't here for your talks, I was in class, but I think faith and religion is one place to open up that conversation a little bit when we start to talk about what are our core values, are the first things that we turn to in understanding what it means to be human, what we owe to one another, what obligations we have to non-human life. I've certainly had lots of conversations with scientists who are happy to talk about those things, at least on a personal basis. Maybe not in their peer-reviewed literature, but we can have those conversations, and then I hope create arenas in which policy in particular can be influenced from both directions. So we're not just listening to the experts with the Western scientific epistemological approach, but also not simply saying it's all culturally relative and we'll just take this group's word for what happens here and this group here. So it has to be about dialogue, right? And ultimately, I would hope a consensus-based decision-making model that respects everyone's input, but is also based in some sort of rational understanding of how the world works.
I think that's a fantastic question. It really gets to the point where, for coalition building, the wheels can come off, right? Where there's good reason why organizations like the IPCC want to see that whoever is asking a question has done their research and their homework, so to speak. But also, certainly in that process, you can see how there could be those who have they know and experience the impacts of climate change and have something worthy to say, but because of whatever educational disparities, whatever might be out there, they might not have access to, or they might not even see, they may have their own good reason for not even seeing, citing some of those things as being relevant when they already know what their own lived experiences is. I think one of the best analogies that I heard came from Robin Wall Kimmerer's talk last year, where she, coming from an indigenous perspective, but getting a training in a Western science background, and she shared some of the struggles that she had with that at first, but then talked about what it's like basically having. She used the analogy of, you can have two different perspectives at the same time, and she said you can look through the world through two different lenses at the same time. She can use her perspective as that she learned from her Potawatomi elders, and she can also use her training. And she uses the analogy of saying, it's like you can have glasses with two different lenses, and what happens when you when you have these different lenses on like this, that you're able to see the world much clearer. They might have different prescriptions or whatever, but you're able to get a much better picture. She had a better way of describing this analogy than me, but the point is that these do not have to be in conflict with each other. And then what she said was kind of, building off your point, Derek, dialogue is really important, but then also certainly, having, ensuring that indigenous communities on the one hand, ensuring that Indigenous communities have access to formal education, that Indigenous people have the opportunities to the same opportunity to become scientists and climate researchers that everyone else does. At the same time, as well as for those that are not Indigenous but already have this training, for them to be able to have experiences where they can learn from Indigenous communities who, in many cases, are experiencing these things firsthand. And some of the examples that I've heard of, there are different. The EPA, to a certain extent, a lot of state EPAs and DNRs across the country will often, in the best examples, work with Indigenous people and have those that can almost serve as kind of climate change spotters, because they might be able to go and see changes in how animals or how the natural world is behaving, and be able to see some of that and be able to tip off others that there's this change taking place, and to have that communication formalized. That's a fantastic question.
We have 5 minutes. I think we have time for one more question. Please feel free to ask.
Yeah, I know.
Raise your hand and ask, anybody. All right.
We have one over here.
Oh, we're good. By all means.
Okay, so it's a much less intellectually based question than it is just an observation. So in the world we live in right now, pop culture rules, and until we can perhaps find a way, and there's a lot of young people in this room, they will find a way to sort of glamorize the idea of climate change and action. And if community awareness is a big part of it, finding that influencer or that person that can put it out there. It's easy to see that poor people or those less privileged are more impacted, but they also don't have as loud of a voice or the resources that others do. And it's up to the young up-and-coming minds to really make this a pop culture issue, because it's not cool, it's not glamorous, and so it doesn't make the news. So it's more of an observation than a question, but just another way of framing it, perhaps.
Thank you. Would either or both of you like to comment on that observation? Please, go right ahead.
It just occurs to me that also reflects the responsibility of people in positions of privilege to amplify the voices of those who are not in positions of privilege, right? So just as an influencer might do that, so could a scientist with the IPCC or an academic or anybody, by, hey, what about, both inviting them to the table, but also, as Ted has just done, representing their views when they're unable to be at the table, metaphorically or in reality.
Well, it's a great question, and one that honestly I've not thought much about. But what you're raising here is, I'll put it this way, that I've my own maybe somewhat jaded view of social media is, people are posting these different things, or if somebody's posting that they care about this issue, are they actually doing anything beyond just posting? And so my first caveat would be kind of before I say that there is a role for social media here, is that nothing is better than actual action in person. But there is a tool now that the more privileged in society have, which is access to the internet anywhere on the phone, and be able to anywhere in the world pretty much, and to be able to produce your own content, and to be able to like or whatever it is to be able to boost the content of others. And so there is some potential there to raise the voice of others, potential where there's no longer just a few companies that are controlling what's out there in the media, that we all have the ability to influence it. And so that is another place where these issues can be brought to attention, while there also being no substitute for actual real world engagement.
Thank you. I have a few concluding words. I would like to inform all of you that hopefully in the next few weeks, video recordings of the entire conference will be on the Peace Studies website. All the proceedings have been recorded by a videotape, so I wanted to inform all of you of that. I also thank all of our panelists and our keynote speaker and everyone who was involved in the conference, and I thank Dr. Larson and Dr. Gordon for your contributions and for responding to the questions and the comments. This concludes our conference, and I wish all of you well. Goodbye.